Welcome to another episode of the Environment in Canada podcast, a podcast about the environment in Canada by Sierra Club Canada. I'm Jessica Murray, Sierra Club Canada's Ontario Director. Today, I am speaking with John Borrows, who is a full professor of law and the Loveland Chair in Indigenous Law at the University of Toronto Faculty of Law. He is known as a leading authority on Canadian Indigenous law, constitutional law, and has been cited by the Supreme Court of Canada. John Borrows is a knowledge keeper from the Chippewas Nawash First Nations located at Cape Croker in the Bruce Peninsula, or known as the Saugeen Peninsula. And today, we talk about Indigenous law and the more than human world, drawing stories from cases about wild rice, also known as Minoan, and the Hoof Clan. We also talk more about John's latest book and about how the Anishinaabe relate to time as something that is not discrete and objective, but fluid and has its own personality. Before we begin, just a reminder that you can take action on environmental issues by visiting sierraclub.ca. We have tons of petitions, other actions and events, and regular new updates you can sign up for on the homepage. You can also find Sierra Club Canada on social media. Our podcast can be found on the Harbinger Media Network, Apple Podcasts, iHeartRadio, our YouTube channel, and on our website, as well as many other places you listen to podcasts. The Environment in Canada podcast is additionally broadcast bi-weekly on CKUT Radio in Montreal, 90.3 FM. Don't forget to follow or subscribe so you can get the latest episodes from us. I hope you'll enjoy this conversation with John Borrows. Thank you so much for joining me, John. I'm so excited to talk with you. Welcome to the Environment in Canada podcast with Sierra Club Canada. I'm really looking forward to this conversation. Maybe we can start with some intros. So
Sure.
I think everybody knows who you are, but it's always kind of interesting to know how people self-introduce themselves. So
Yeah. So first in the language, Giganos Indigenicas, Nea Shiwinigaming and Donjabani Gigandodem. So John Borrows, I'm the Loveland Chair in Indigenous Law at the University of Toronto Law School right now.
that's beautiful. And your introduction is short and brief, but I think it's an understatement of your contribution as well as your position in Indigenous law and just the body of knowledge that you carry. So I want to bring that in as well.
Thank you. No, I try. I love learning. And so I think that's one of the things that motivates me each day is to keep trying to expand the possibilities of what's out there in terms of what I can know and pass along.
That's a beautiful intention. So just for the purpose of the conversation, I like to kind of separate Aboriginal law as in like the Canadian version of Indigenous law, and then Indigenous law as in like within the bodies of First Nations themselves as like governing bodies, their own sets of laws. Because I think in the question of truth and reconciliation, we're kind of seeing these two different ways and hopefully some conversations between them. And that's kind of where I wanted to start the conversation with you.
Well, I also make that distinction, but I also see that they can be related too. So that's great.
Yeah. I'd love to hear more about, at this current juncture, I guess, whether you're seeing that there's more openness to recognizing Indigenous laws within Canadian law, the legal system as well.
Yeah, I see that at different levels. So I think you're seeing that more in the community level where that revitalization is happening in band councils and looking to see where there's the opportunity to share that information with proponents and governments through consultation and accommodation protocols. You'll also see some of that happening in the legislatures, recognizing Indigenous law and referentially incorporating that as federal law is one of the models. And then I think the courts are also doing that, but I see that more in the lower courts right now. The Supreme Court is certainly creating a framework for it, but at the same time, going quite slow in trying to make sure that they don't get ahead of the other branches of government and communities, I suppose.
It's always kind of tricky that way, isn't it?
Yeah,
Staying within your lane.
that's right. So I can, appreciate why they want to exercise judicial restraint. They are not elected. They do need to take direction from other parts of society. At the same time, we want them to be able to identify the things that are happening, and that is slowly going on in the courts, although I'm trying not to be impatient.
Yeah, it's interesting. I was just about to kind of shift gears and you bring up the feeling of impatience. I wanted to get a sense of how your outlook is, or kind of just how you feel about where we are, I guess, as a society, as Canadians, as we begin to really look at what reconciliation is actually going to look like.
Yeah, I think one of the things I appreciate is that it's not just legislatures and courts that are picking up this work. So the 94 calls to action from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission were really also addressed to what we call civil society. And so to see businesses and museums and arts organizations and universities and healthcare providers and other the churches, in other words, I see that what's exciting is that it's not just a hierarchical top-down
Mm.
approach, but it's becoming more infused in various parts of society in accordance with the needs of and the connections, I guess, that they have with Indigenous communities in those spaces. So
Yeah,
that's hopeful.
yeah, and I think it's important to kind of like celebrate the wins that are happening for sure. And I think overall, speaking of kind of like when we're talking about environmental climate change and kind of activism around that, I find whereas sometimes it can be hard, let's say for a protest or a rally to have a really good show for, let's say, a climate rally, where I have seen kind of repeated support is when it's like a First Nations, group that is really leading it. And then I think it is very hopeful and inspiring to see the non-Indigenous community come out and support them. So I would like to echo that there are some really good things and exciting things happening as well.
Yeah, I see that in my classes too, where students have some knowledge, particularly compared to, say, 15 or 20 years ago. And that knowledge is usually more or less spread through the class, whereas before it might have been just someone who was studying Indigenous studies, for instance, at university. Now I think it's coming to them in secondary school. It's happening
Mhm.
in different disciplines. And then that means when you have a call out to do something, there's a little bit more appreciation as to why that might be important in those settings.
Yeah, I think there's a good amount of readiness for more integration and bringing that in. So that's really beautiful. I know you recently lectured at Western,
Yes.
and I had a chance to listen in. So I thought we'd maybe highlight some of the stories that you featured in that lecture, because maybe they'll be top of mind and still fresh.
Yes.
So I just really loved some of the stories that you shared. Because I think, like I say, I think there's a lot of curiosity. Is like, well, what are the differences between Canadian law and, laws within Indigenous groups, which, of course, keeping in mind that the laws might be quite different between different bands as well, right? So
Yeah.
it's important to also keep that awareness that the stories that we share are about this specific band council or group of people and not to be extrapolated into a pan-Indigenous kind of way of understanding First Nations culture and ways of being.
I think I really appreciate what the Chippewa of the Thames have done recently. They're called the Deishkan Zebing, and they're a community that's a bit west of Toronto, a couple of hours outside of what's now called London, Ontario. And really, what I appreciate about them is the constitution that they promulgated has a recognition of, as we would say, the more than human world in that constitution. They recognize, for instance, the agency, the legal sort of personality of fish and animals and plants and birds. And in that context, they see that the decision making that they have to engage in is fully a part of the surrounding territory that they're in. And then you take that a little bit further, and they say that everyone in that territory has the rights to be inherent as recipients of those rights. And so that for me is really powerful. All the rights entitled to all the waterways within the territory are extended to fish, rocks, plants, flyers, crawlers, and four-leggeds. And so that, is happening in that setting. And then they've also developed a consultation protocol under Canadian law dealing with Aboriginal peoples. There's this doctrine, if you're going to infringe rights, you have to consult with Aboriginal peoples, and then you have to accommodate them. And then in the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, it says that there should be a right to free, prior, and informed consent if you're going to deal with Indigenous peoples. And so the Anishinaabe there, the Deishkan people have taken that constitutional provision, recognizing the more than human world, and said, when we do work with one another, we're going to recognize that we're sharing the world. with their
Mm.
clans, and that this sharing has shaped our treaties with the more than human world, our treaties with the British, and that settlers are drawn into that web of kinship relations through the treaty process. And so that to the extent that consultation and accommodation happens in the light of these Anishinaabe legal principles, then you get Anishinaabe law applied not only by the Deishkan people, but by the governments, by the proponents that come to work with them. And then the other part of this agreement, which I really appreciate, this consultation protocol, is the advancing of what we call our 7 grandmother and grandfather principles of wisdom and love, respect, bravery, honesty, humility, and truth. And so taking those principles and seeing those principles is also necessary to living in good relationship with the earth is something that will happen through the Constitution and the consultation and accommodation protocols. Could develop that further, but I can stop here if you want to. But this is happening in Minnesota with a wild rice law. There's some climate change litigation with the Grand Council of Treaty 3. We're also there bringing these same kinds of views into all of their legal relationships.
Yeah, that's really beautiful. And you brought up the wild rice or the Monoman, and I would love to. I think that's a really interesting case study because the Anishinaabe are both in what is known as United States and so-called Canada as well. So it's to me, it's quite an interesting situation where we're looking at almost like a cross-border kind of understanding of how we govern the world and take care of it. And then I guess it also kind of relates to the fact that the Great Lakes are right there as well, too, right? And again, that's also shared by the different groups, Canada, US, and Anishinaabe. And so it's a really interesting case study. So maybe we can talk a little bit more about that if you're
Okay.
up for it.
Yeah, that sounds great. So I'm obviously in Toronto right now and teaching near my reserve, which is about 3 hours away. But I did teach at the University of Minnesota for 5 years and got to know the Anishinaabe people there on the other side of the Great Lakes. And the same language by and large, and stories and political and legal structures in terms of clans and treaties, etc. And what they've done is they've received recognition of having treaty rights that run off reserve, and they can regulate these treaty rights off reserve. And they've created relationships with Michigan, Wisconsin, and Minnesota to kind of co-manage in those relationships. But one of the things that the Anishinaabe people have been concerned about on that side of the lake is pipelines, and they're worried about the water that gets used in the process of the creation of the pipelines. And they also, of course, worry about potential degradation of that water if there's going to be some kind of spill. And so under their treaty authority, what they did is they recognized that wild rice or Monoman has inherent rights to exist. And they say that those rights include flourishing and regenerating and evolving, and that those rights include restoration, recovery, and preservation. And so in this law that recognizes wild rice's own legal personality, they say that there's a right to pure water and freshwater habitat and a right to a healthy climate and natural environment. And in particular, they make reference to be free from human-caused global warming impacts and emissions. And there's further parts of the law that talk about being free from infection and infestation and drift from genetically modified seeds. And so the idea is that this on its own has its legal personality. And then there's provisions to enforce that law. It's unlawful to violate Monoman's rights in this area. And that if a government or a business or a private or public entity would violate these rights, they're liable for damages. And part of the damages that they would be required to make whole is measured by the cost of restoring Monoman as well as its habitat. And so the law recognizing Monoman with its own legal personality, if there is a violation, recognizes this idea of restoration. And then this can be enforced within a court, tribal court, for instance. And so what happened is an action was brought in the White Earth Tribal Court asking for a declaratory and adjunctive relief because there was a perceived threat to Monoman as a result of 5 billion gallons of public ground and surface water that could be used for drilling rivers and whatnot under the Mississippi watershed. And so here's the First Nation and the treaty authority promulgating this law on behalf of wild Rice, Mahnomen. There is all of these systems. And then there's this allegation of damage. And then it goes to the tribal court. And the tribal court actually finds, hey, we don't have jurisdiction off of the reservation to be able to deal with that question of Wild Rice's own rights. And I have a challenge with that reading from that tribal court there. I've taught federal Indian law. I know that there are jurisdictional elements that tribes have off of the reserve there, off the reservation, as they say. And so I think that the court was a little bit too circumspect. They could have found a wild rice protection off of the reservation in accordance with their treaties and in accordance with the subject matter that the tribe has in tribal court to be able to deal with these questions. I guess the message here is that even under Anishinaabe law or Indigenous law, that doesn't mean that at the end of the day, that's going to do all the work that we hope needs to be done, which is why, again, it's so important to work beyond courts, even tribal courts, to try to solve these questions.
I'm really curious as to your perspective on why you think the tribal court found that. Considering just how connected everything is, it's really hard to divide nature that way, right? So it's kind of curious to me as to why they came to that conclusion. Was there reasoning behind, you think?
So I think part of the reasoning is the federal, state, tribal political jurisdictions, legal jurisdictions in the United States. And so tribes are a third order of government in the United States alongside the state and federal fora. And there's, well-developed rules as to who should have jurisdiction over what. And I just think it's applying the more conventional rules that are in the broader system, recognizing that division where, the state wouldn't have authority on the tribal lands and the tribe wouldn't have authority on the state lands. That's sort of the general rule. But that is not the rule in the case with treaty rights, because treaty rights in a case called Mille Lacs, which comes out of Minnesota, those can be exercised off reserve and can be regulated off of reserve. And so I just think the court read a convention too narrowly and didn't actually follow the treaty jurisprudence in that area.
That's interesting. So in terms of that case, is there a next step where they can appeal or do anything about that? Or is that kind of just...
That's kind of it, because that's the equivalent of the Supreme Court in the White Earth Nation. So you can imagine that they would reformulate the law perhaps, and maybe there would be an action that's brought on the reservation where something that's happening off the reservation, say water quality or quantity, is affecting on reservation rights. And then the tribal court might say, oh yeah, we've got jurisdiction on the reserve. And as a result of that, then there could be, implications for off-reservation activity at that point. But I haven't heard that's occurring, but I can imagine that would be another step to try to take this law's principles into application.
And I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but it's almost like, from what I heard you speak about at the lecture, it was almost like, well, I think you used the term, it's not ripe yet, like no damage has been done yet. And it just seems to me a little bit kind of like, so we're going to wait for the damage to happen and then restore. It just seems a little bit like, it's going to happen.
Yeah, you want to put the fence at the top of the hill rather than the ambulance at the bottom of the hill, right? So that you don't have the people wandering off. So yes, I think that's what the Treaty Authority was trying to do, and the White Earth Reservation was trying to do, is be more proactive and prevent the harm from happening. There is this doctrine, though, in judicial circles called ripeness, meaning you can't bring the action until it's actually transpired. And the idea here is that you want to preserve judicial resources, because you can't just be speculating to all the possible things that would happen in the world and bring actions before they actually transpire. So this is, we were talking about earlier, that the judges try to stay in their lane, and this is one way they try to stay in their lane, is only rule on actions when there's actually that's before them.
But this case in particular was about Enbridge, isn't that right?
I think it's line 3. I think that's it.
Yeah. Right? So Enbridge is line 3. And I just wonder, it's like, well, we've seen the history, like Enbridge's track record, and I just wonder whether that could have played more into the analysis because, there already has been a spill. Bad River Band is still kind of dealing with that even years after the initial spill happened.
Yeah.
So, yeah, to me, I guess, I mean, I often feel this way about the world, but I feel very puzzled. Like, what are we doing? What's
Yeah.
on?
You're right. And yet the challenge from a legal perspective is that you can't have something wrong happen and then pass a law to try to deal with the wrong that happened in the past. In other
Mm,
words, that's a retrospective law. So say you and I did something wrong and it's not illegal, but 2 months from now, the legislature acts to try to make the thing illegal when it wasn't
yeah.
illegal, we'd go, no, wait a second, that's unfair. That's not due process. And so I think that's the challenge here is you can't bring an action before it's actually transpired, and you can't also pass a law to just deal with something that's happened in the past because you need the law to be there first
Hmm.
before the action can be brought in relationship to the harm.
There's a bit of a circular reasoning there, though, isn't it?
There is a circular reasoning, that's right. And so what they're trying to do is keep time in check. And you know that that's not always possible. I've written a book, it's not published yet, but it's going to be out there soon. It's called Life's Shifting Cycles. And it's trying
Mm.
to understand that we can't just control linearity in the way
Hmm.
that you and I are talking about right now. And
Sure.
causation in time doesn't always flow in that linear fashion as well. And so to draw on Anishinaabe insights around, we call the good life, the fast life, the wandering life, the doing life, the planning life, realizing life, and the elder life, right? The notion is that we need to think of time more holistically as well. But the courts are not doing that. But that doesn't mean that you and I can't do that, or legislatures can't do that, or First Nations can't act in other ways to try to deal with prevention or to try
Mhm.
to clean up the mess that we've already created.
Yeah, I guess in some ways the law is almost like you almost like don't want to have to use the law. If we've gotten there, it's kind of like, oh, well, something not so great has already happened.
Yeah, we certainly don't want to use those official channels of law, but what would be great is if we could use Anishinaabe law or Indigenous law
Mm.
to prevent things, right? Like if we carried around the idea of love and wisdom and humility and truth, then those are preventative legal principles. And so we
Yeah.
want to use law then before something happens. And hopefully then we don't have to get to the courts.
Yeah, because I mean, you talk about love and wisdom and truth and honesty, and I wonder how often those words show up in Canadian legislature as even of values, right?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, you can see, you swear to tell the truth in
That's true.
cases. And so there's that honesty and truth that's found there. And we do, want to find places of respect and courage, but they're just so much more prominent in this Anishinaabe legal formulation. In Canada, United States, we talk about life, liberty, and security, and equality, and
Mhm.
and good principles. But there's a different aim with Anishinaabe law. Like, let's
Yeah.
talk about love. Let's
I was
let's
just gonna say that's
have
the main thing that I think was missing. Like not it isn't the word of love. Yeah. And I think maybe love is seen as like this kind of squishy, too soft, doesn't belong in something that's so
yeah, as if life, liberty, and security isn't squishy and
about love.
soft, right?
Yeah.
Those are really hard things to work out too. But I think the challenge is that people don't want to be coerced to love. And in Western
Mm.
law, we think of law as coercion, and
Mm.
it's not love if you're coerced. But in Anishinaabe law, law is not only, it does have an aspect if you want it in particular areas to be enforced, but it's not primarily relying on coercion. So you can
Mm.
talk about love in relationship to Anishinaabeg law and not coerce someone into a relationship. Whereas in the Western forms, yeah, that's more challenging.
So I wonder if we're almost like kind of picking up on a cultural difference. Like I think in the Western world, the idea of love is it's for your significant other, it's for your family. And I mean, sometimes there's conversation of like love as like for friends and comradeship. But often it just sounds like to me, and correct me if I'm wrong, that in at least an Anishinaabe way of viewing life, love is more expansive than that. It's not nearly quite as limited and finite.
Well, it could be. So there's different words for love. And
Okay.
one of our words for love is the Gidawin, which is stingy love, like an exclusive love, as it were.
Okay, sure.
And so we need that because we want to have some fidelity between people and relationships. But the idea of Joanum is a notion of love that is about compassion and recognition of our mutual needs and our interdependence. And that sense of love is the concept, is the practice that can be legally enacted, that we
Mm,
do have reciprocity in law, that there is opportunity for recognizing the interdependence of people and species. And so, yeah, I think that we can do more to explain the possibilities of law and love through an Anishinaabe legal lens, and then find perhaps analogies in Canadian law, not all over the place, of course, but in defined channels so that you can, get some rough comparisons happening there.
sure. Does anything come to mind in terms of an analogy?
So I think of the work that's done around restorative justice in some of
Mm,
the Western legal systems that isn't just about past backward looking, let's identify who's to blame, but
mm,
forward looking, let's get better, let's heal from the
mm,
damage that's been occurring. And so when you talk about the healing, when you talk about the restoration, when you talk about restorative justice, then it's not only about love. There's also all those other values too. You want truth and honesty and respect and courage, etc. But there's more of a place for thinking about the mutuality of our reciprocities there, and that the fellow feeling, as it were,
mm.
for one another in that setting.
Just in case our listeners are kind of new to the concept of restorative justice, could you kind of flesh out what that is? What does it look like in action?
Yeah, so let's just give an example.
Sure.
Some young person is upset, angry, and they go into the school and they put graffiti all over the walls of the gym, and they maybe break a window, and they maybe just throw all the teacher supplies all over the floor. Our conventional system of justice in the Western realm would be to try to figure out whether or not that person did it. So we'd be looking to find blame, as it were, for
Mm,
that person. And then that person would be charged, convicted to deal with that past harm. But in a restorative justice system, you would bring that person in and they would sit with the custodian and hear from the custodian all the work they have to do to clean that up. And they might hear from the superintendent of the school boards to know how much it costs to be able to clean it up. And they might hear from the teacher in terms of their investment of time and energy, so that they internalize some of the costs that they created for others in that process. And then they might, as a part of the sentence, as it were, be asked to work with the custodian for a
mm,
month and see what that's like, or perhaps be a shadow to a teacher for a couple of weeks as they're cleaning up at the end of the day, so that rather than being sequestered away, being fined, or being imprisoned and
mm,
externalizing, that's someone else's problem. I just sit here, do my time, pay my dues. This actually requires an active engagement of the
mm,
person that's done the wrong. And so there's a restoration that can occur that would also maybe change that person's own heart and what
mhm.
it's an educational opportunity in many respects. And so that's what I mean by restorative justice, is trying to bring out the interdependencies, the reconciliations, I suppose, that restorative justice is aiming at.
Yeah, and what I also see in that is almost like in the more conventional method, you're almost like casting them out. You're exiled, we're done, pay this and we'll move on. But this is like, you're not going anywhere. You're staying right here.
That's right.
And it's like we're still together and we're going to talk this out and we're going to make our work our way through this. Uh,
Yeah. Yeah, and of course there can be a role for denunciation and separation. There's
sure,
some
sure, sure, of
things that
course.
require that, but just to go to that by default in all of our circumstances is to cut us off from
Yeah.
the restorative justice dimensions.
That's really beautiful. Thank you for clarifying that and fleshing that
Yeah,
out.
yeah.
I wanted to come back to your book because I believe you were writing it for quite some time and it sounds like you just finished. So Yeah, I'd love to. I love thinking about time. Like I've learned about concepts like deep time that seem to be kind of like at least analogous to some of the things that you've been saying. So I'd love to hear more on kind of about your book and I guess your perspective on time. And maybe this is a draws from Anishinaabe culture as well.
Yeah. So the point is that, right now for us, it's the same time on the clock.
2:31?
There we
Yeah.
go.
Okay.
And so there's a
Agreed.
kind of a synchronicity in
For
relationship to
sure.
how we measure time. But you've got different things going through your mind. I've got different things going through my mind. And that will bring us into an asynchronous relationship with time. In other
Mm,
words, you will perceive time differently than I will, despite us being at the same moment on the clock. And then that opens up a world of possibilities for us to help one another appreciate all of the opportunities that exist in relationship to time because it's not just objective. There's a subjectivity in regard to how we relate with time. And that subjectivity means that I can be benefited by how you structure your life's patterns. I might be able to learn from that and perhaps pick up something in my patterns because of what you're doing with your patterns. Or the contrast between those patterns might also illustrate a mindfulness for me about what I am doing that I wouldn't otherwise appreciate if I just thought, this is the only way of doing things in the world. So
mm,
I guess the point of the book is to recognize the living nature of time, that time is
mm,
being, that it has a personality, and that we relate to time as not an it, but as a force. And in an Anishinaabe, when you mark out time, you actually mark time as an agent, third, fourth person, as we talk about that in our etymologies. And that just means that I can be more available, I suppose, to other people, recognizing that I'm not just relating them with a clock, but I can be available to them in other measures, in other ways of thinking about passages. And so the book is an attempt to do that work of opening up space to be more available to more than human world, the human world, because there's fluidity with time. It's
mm,
not just a rigid set of mechanistic approaches. Time is experiential. It's not
mm.
just chronological. And so to bring out that aspect is a part of what I'm trying to do. And then I've tried to talk about this in regard to some environmental settings around deep time and geological time and colonial time and elder time. We can talk about that if you'd like. But in thinking about our relationships around climate change, particularly, we can have another view when we see time more fluidly.
Tell me more about what you mean by that. This is all sounds very fascinating. So yeah, keep.
Yeah. So we have stories as Anishinaabe people in this territory of how the earth was formed on the back of a turtle.
Mm,
And there's a whole creation story that would take hours to tell. But part of what we see in our territory is that these Niagara Escarpment features that run back the Ontario over to Michigan and Wisconsin. That Niagara Escarpment was formed 440 million years ago, and it was formed at the equator when Ontario, what is now Ontario, was a warm, shallow sea. And there was
mm,
all of these little swimmers in that water, and it was much like the Great Barrier Reef.
mm,
And eventually they die, and dying upon one another, they form these corals and these reefs, and this limestone feature gets built, and then plate tectonics happens, and over 440 million years, what was once at the equator drifts into our territory, drifts to the latitude that it is now. And what that means for climate change is to recognize the earth moves, the earth is
mm,
dynamic, the earth is fluid. It has had changes through time, and those changes are there for us to see when we're looking across the cliff face at the Niagara Escarpment. We also see that there are those changes when we look back 12,000 years ago here. So moving from deep time to geological time, if I stood here in Toronto and looked up a kilometer above my head, there'd be an ice sheet that would rise that high. And that ice sheet pressed down on the earth and caused the earth to change its form. And
Mhm.
of course, when it started to melt, it created all sorts of rivers and lakes and different, rebounds in the earth and depressions in the earth. So in other words, there was another dimension of climate change, as it were. And Anishinaabe people start to have stories of their own personal experiences as the waters melt here. We have other stories about these times. So those two are climate change that's natural. But the next two stories, the next two measures of time show human provoked climate change. So again, standing in Toronto here 500 years ago, there would have been Wendat people, Seneca people, Haudenosaunee people, Huron, tobacco, and neutral people. And then quickly the climate changed because people came and they started cutting down the pine and oak forests, which caused the streams to warm, which led to changes in microclimates. And then the fields were planted with monocultures, which creates further microclimatic changes. And so from 500 years ago to now, in this colonial time, we've seen the dramatic
Mm.
change of these environments, human caused, right? And then, of course, in the last 90 years, if you talk to elders, they will tell you that the fish are running at different times, or there's no more certain species of fish that are running anymore, or the flowers are blooming at a different period.
Mm.
The sap is running from the maple sugar and birch trees much earlier than it used to. And so you get the sense of human caused climate change from these elder stories that is because of those colonial time events that we were in. And that means that the larger changes that we saw in the geological cycles or the deep time cycles are being accelerated.
Mhm.
It's becoming more dangerous for human and more than human, sorry, to exist in those places. And so I often say, if you want to know what it's like to live through an apocalypse of climate change, look
Mhm.
to an indigenous nation and see how their climates, their environments have been changed over the past 300 years. And look what the people are doing, how, they've been impoverished and they
Mm.
are not as well fed and sheltered as they were. And part of that is because of the manipulation that's happened through colonialism. But a part of it is that we just don't have the same carrying capacity of the land as well. And so um, and likewise with the last 90 years of climate change, if you want to know what the future might look like, you can see resilience. Indigenous peoples have been resilient in the faces
Mhm.
of these collapses, but that resilience doesn't bring back the fish and doesn't cool down the air like we need. And so this is what I mean in thinking about the relationships to time that we might have and how we can think through we might do, for instance, around climate change.
Mhm.
Which I know I'm talking a lot now, but there's this case that came out of Ontario recently, the Mather case, which is about climate change. And
Mhm.
there was an argument that the emissions targets being changed was going to allow was going to create greater hazard for young people. And so
Mhm.
young people brought a charter challenge saying that their life, liberty, and security was being violated under Section 7 because they would be more heavily impacted by climate change, say as a 15-year-old than you would as a 70-year-old. And the court found, oh no, life, liberty, and security that can't be brought forward in this instance being appealed to the Court of Appeal now. And
Mm.
the Grand Council of the Treaty 3, which is an Anishinaabe group north of Minnesota in the western parts of Ontario, talk about these relationships to time. And they
Mm.
say in Canadian courts, we need to have both Aboriginal law and Indigenous law address the question of climate change because it's about these, as I've been saying, these relations with our kin, the more than human world, the Minoman, the wild rice, or the our clan relatives, or the corn, or whatever the case is. So I guess I'm seeing and saying that you're seeing these concepts of time that Anishinaabe people have moving into not only things like the Minoman law, but also moving into climate change litigation as well.
Mm. There's so much there. Yeah.
Yeah. And so when you think about being so much there, what we need is one another, right?
Yeah.
We need to slow down
Mm, yeah.
because there's just so much to process. And we
Yeah. Tell me
need
about it.
each other to process through what those implications are for one another. And then again, like those consultation protocols I talked about with the Deishgan being how do we make sure that we're living Mino Matsu in the good life? How do we ensure that we can keep all those relations that we're so dependent upon as humans?
Hmm. And part of what your talk that I was listening to earlier, you talked about kind of existing treaties that the Indigenous First Nations had with the more than human world. So there was a story about a treaty with Buffalo, a treaty with the Hoof Clan. And I'm curious to know when, let's say, a First Nations community is finding that some sort of let's pretend it's a corporation. They're infringing on their ability to um, let's say hunt caribou, just as an example.
Yeah.
Do you find then that in that court of law, when it comes up, that they're able to say, well, we have this treaty with the caribou, and because this came far before colonialism even happened, this actually, I don't know if time plays into it, but actually this came first, and actually this would supersede anything that you say after. Is there
Yeah.
anything along those lines that's allowed?
Yeah. So that's the implication of the argument. If we have treaties with the more than human world, those treaties are the first treaties and they have priority over the subsequent treaties.
Mm-hmm.
They can be harmonized with those subsequent treaties. That's what we tried to do, was invite the British settlers into those treaties we had with the Hoof
Mm-hmm.
Nation, say, or other groups. But so far, courts have not taken that approach. They've
Mm-hmm.
not said, "Oh, we need to view our treaties, that is, the treaties with the Crown, in light of those treaties with the more than human world." They've not done that,
Mm-hmm.
and they've certainly not said, "Oh, and those first treaties with the more than human world are the priority treaties. They're stronger than the treaties you made with the British Crown." We might argue that as Anishinaabe people, but we would also argue that the importance of those treaties with the Crown should be reconciled. We should be able to put those two things together and
Mm-hmm.
see that the implementation of the treaty with the Crown is an implementation of the treaty with the Hoof Nation, not regarding them as either or, but regarding them as being, again, related.
Mm-hmm. I think something you also touched on in your talk was that there's space in when you're kind of relating with the more than human world, that there's a level of kind of interpretation. It's not magical, but it's like you're kind of listening in a way that's nonverbal. It's not like in language. It's done maybe through the body, maybe through our senses. I'm not sure. You can clarify that if you like. Like it's like a whole other way of being that I find perhaps at the Western world is still, I don't know if they've maybe like a lack of embracing it or kind of like are still kind of learning it, even though it's where we come from. This strange homecoming to return back to what we already were in some ways.
Yeah, no, that's a beautiful way of expressing it, a homecoming to return to who we are. I think that's
Mhm.
part of the challenge here. I do think that in the Western ways, we have information that's provided to us about listening to the more than human world. The
Mhm.
challenge right now is that it's couched in the language of science. So, of
Yeah.
course, we do important studies and we need to control for variables to understand what the need of the watershed is, or the animal group, or the particular fish, as it were. And that's all well and good. We need to keep doing that work. But to see it as those things that are communicated through science have to be taken into the mind and into the body, into the heart in particular, so that our decision making is connected to the more cold calculation, I suppose, that you would see that science often engaged with. And so we can do that in Western forms, but we are prevented by almost this bifurcation between science and other approaches to life. Whereas in Anishinaabe forms, in the language through thousands of years has been embedded observation about the more than human world. So to learn the language is to learn some of the things that animals
Mhm.
and plants and fish have been telling you through the years. And then stories have been passed along about these relatives that we have that give us some more of that information. And we have clan responsibilities. And part of what we uptake in our clan responsibilities is what we learn from, say, the bear or the pike or the otter in my case. And so you have that as an aspect. And then, of course, you have the deliberation that's there and you have the constant observation. In other words, it's not magic because it's a system of observation and relationship that's just encoded in a way that doesn't always bifurcate what we learn from the more than human world. And then because it's more coldly and calculating, we think it's magic somehow to think that
Mhm.
we can understand what wild rice might be needing to be healthy in the future. Well, it's not. You could get there through science, but you can also get there by triangulating, cross-referencing, putting together the varied insights that, say, Anishinaabe people might bring to that. And then, of course, it's even stronger if you can combine that with science, which is what they tried to do in that case we talked about earlier.
I think something that I really love about more and more exposure to Anishinaabe ways of thinking and stories is the storytelling. And I think it's really, I think that like, I mean, in general, I think storytelling is such a profound way of learning and to be able to learn through metaphor and symbolism without kind of like the dry, like spelling it out, this is what happened and therefore X, Y, and Z. And I was just thinking that it's not like the Western world doesn't tell stories. And I think if we were able to recognize that, it's like we're always telling ourselves a story. And that's just kind of like how being a human being, having a mind, and how you're going to process information, it's through stories. And it's good to recognize. And also, it's almost a kind of like, it's almost like the fish that doesn't realize that it's in water.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so we do process meaning through stories with narratives attached to them. And sometimes that can get us into problems. We have to be aware of the danger of a single story. We
Yeah.
want to hear a variety of stories. So again, we can cross-reference and triangulate. And then that opens up space for participation, right?
Mm,
When you hear a story, you're often invited into interpretation, and that telling and then talking about what it means can
yeah.
be radically democratic, radically participatory activity. It means that we don't just give it to a judge to tell us, oh, what's the meaning of that case
Yeah.
or that
Yeah.
story, or over to a legislature. We together can work through what meaning is, and that hope is the democratic potential of Indigenous law, the participatory potential of Indigenous law, the notion that we are invited into a relationship as opposed to giving it to someone else to tell us what
Hmm.
to do.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
Yeah. Yeah.
that's key for me.
Yeah, that's so beautiful. It's almost like the story is a tool for then just for further understanding and sharing of perspectives. Because I'm sometimes like, when I'm in circles with others, it's like it's sometimes quite profound what people share. And it's like you don't ex you didn't might not have experienced that yourself, but when you hear it, you're like, oh yeah, I can totally see that. And that's like a really beautiful experience that everybody leaves kind of with something fresh and new that they wouldn't have had otherwise. So I love that.
Yeah, I mean, again, you're trying to understand someone else,
Mm.
and if you can put off your own egocentric nature for a moment, right? If I
Yeah.
can do that, then I can be more likely to learn from that other person, and then perhaps change the way I'm thinking about it because I've recognized they've got something I don't have, and I need them. I
Yeah.
can't be fully what I'd like to be without other people
Yeah.
around me.
Yeah. It kind of makes me think of like sometimes we talk about interconnectedness, but it's like instead of saying like we have a relationship, I've also heard the saying we are a relationship.
Mhm.
And I really like that as well. I think it's so easy to think that we're separate. And it's very like quickly when you start to like remove, you can't like take any of the elements away without everything kind of falling apart. So it's
Yeah,
really beautiful to just kind of really kind of constantly, it's like our mind is constantly saying that these are different objects in different places and they're separate when the reality is the opposite. And you constantly have to be kind of like exposing yourself to that experience to really keep living into that.
Yeah, that's right. So, Walt Whitman said, I contain multitudes. That notion that we are a relationship is so profound. And, I've also heard, I think it's Thich Nhat Hanh talks about when I'm eating a sandwich, I'm related to the sun who
Mm,
gave the light, and I'm related to the water that fell on the roots, and I'm related to the laborer who collects the wheat, and I'm related to the baker. So that, just sitting with that sandwich is to sit with a multitude of relationships that we might not otherwise appreciate unless we slow down and see the narrative that's in that I am relationship point that you made a moment ago.
yeah, it's so beautiful. And I wanted to just bring that to kind of full circle to kind of a related concept that I heard you say that nuance is sacred. I wanted to finish off on that because I think we've really lost the practice of engaging with nuance, to being open to nuance. It's like there's like a kind of knee-jerk reaction of any nuance mean like is just a reason to cast someone out.
Yeah.
And we're at a time where we need each other even more to really kind of pull through for the planet, for each other. Um, and yeah, I'm curious to know kind of your thoughts as to how to regain that, like to kind of pull ourselves out of that nosedive of kind of the tendency to reject and push away.
Yeah. So I think part of that is embracing the different ways of relating with time. That,
Mm,
there's a maybe there's a moment for social media time, but people are sometimes spending 8, 9 hours a day on social media. And there's a moment to be able to have the kind of conversation you and I are having. And there's a moment to sit quietly in a park, and there's a moment to, go running. There's a moment to maybe be in a ritual, church or a synagogue or whatever that might look like. And there's a moment to be able to find yourself in a friend situation where you're just all talking at the same time and talking over one another. And we get into chambers, I think particularly with social media, where there's just one way of communicating that tends to bifurcation and dichotomization and polarization. And we need to pull out of that back into these other socialities to be able
mm,
to see that we can relate with time in different ways. And then the nuance emerges because
mm,
what was happening in this place is different than this place, but they're connected. And I can see the shades of possibility that are there. It's not just an either or. There's, all sorts of granulation that
mm.
exists in those places too. So, yeah, that's my sense is that we do that with our bodies, and we need to just get away from our eyes with screens in order to have that occur.
Yeah, I love that. Well, thank you so much. I think it's nice to kind of leave on a note of what I'm taking away. So what I'm taking away is for me is this idea that time is alive. I almost like as an artist, I kind of think like, what would time look like? Like, does it have a feeling right now?
Who is time?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Where did who's its mother?
Yeah.
Do I need to tend to it? Kind of like a really interesting thought experiment there. So thank you for that. And I was wondering for you, whether is there like a kernel that you'd like to leave with our listeners as a takeaway or something you'd like to take away?
I guess just the joy in being able to talk with you is part of the joy of life. That is, if we
Mm,
can keep searching out one another, and
mm,
you and I hadn't met before being on this conversation today, but I find that this is what days can look like. You can just encounter people and be surprised and find that possibility. And so, thank you for the gift of reaching out and being able to learn more. It's good to be with you today.
Oh, it's so good to be with you too. Thank you so much for your time and your wisdom and all your sharing and everything you contribute to the world of law. All of
Thanks.
that too.
Thanks.
Hi everyone, Connor Curtis, Head of Communications with Sierra Club Canada, jumping in here to do the Q&A for this week. A quick note before we begin, the Q&A section of our podcast is just us responding to questions on behalf of Sierra Club Canada. The views we express here are not on behalf of our guests on the podcast. We have a question this week, which is, why aren't all roofs and pavement being painted white to supplement glacial reflection of the sun? And this is a very interesting question. I was not as familiar with this particular idea as a concept, and I'm not going to claim to be an expert in any way in responding to it, but I was able to do a bit of research, and what I found out was actually quite interesting. For one thing, this has been discussed for quite a long time. There are articles going back at least 10 years discussing this as an option. Part of our work with climate change is how do we both mitigate and adapt to its effects at the same time. And in that respect, this does seem to have some promise in certain areas. In fact, one of the biggest benefits to it is not so much the reduction in climate change, but a reduction in ambient heat within the house and within city areas when basically house roofs are white. The only issue I could see with pavement being painted white is you might run into in certain situations something similar to what happens actually if you're in a very snowy area and it's quite bright outside, which is snow blindness. So obviously this isn't going to affect the painting of roofs, or the change in the coloration of roofs to reflect sunlight, but this could be an issue if you're putting a lot of white surfaces at ground level. And this is actually where the reflection from the light, if you're not familiar with it, is so intense from the pavement or white surface on the ground that it actually can affect your eyesight. Again, I'm not going to pretend to be an expert on any of this. That's something that just came to mind when I was thinking about this and its potential limitations. My grandfather actually used to have a pair of special sunglasses for in the north, protecting your eyes from snow blindness. So this was very interesting though, and this is actually being done in some other places. In India, for instance, there are initiatives, what seems to be a local level, that are attempting to get people to paint their roofs white, and it actually does seem to have a positive effect. Again, maybe less so in terms of preventing climate change or reducing the impacts of climate change, although it does seem to have some benefit in that respect, but more so in sort of reducing overheating within houses. This gave me another really interesting thing to think about, which was how would you make this practical from a policy perspective. And for those of you who don't know, I studied environmental policy, so I'm always interested in the problem solving of that. There have been attempts to do some of this to encourage basically lighter roof tiling in the United States. It does receive heavy pushback from industry. Exactly why is a little bit vague, but basically the same story as always. So I think that there would need to be a very strong push for something like this, and it would need to be against potentially industry backlash. Of course, I'm saying all this, none of this is the solution to climate change, of course, and to our person who wrote in the question, I didn't get the feeling that's what you were suggesting at all either. The main way we solve climate change is to reduce emissions that are coming out. But this is an interesting solution that seems to have a lot of benefits for urban areas in other ways. There are some times when it might actually be the opposite way that you want to go, and you want your roof to actually be a darker color, because if you live in a relatively cold area, a darker roof can actually help reduce your electricity bill, which if you are reliant upon electricity that comes from a fossil fuel source at this time, that might be a good way to actually reduce your reliance on that electricity and on the fossil fuel source. So there's nuance here. It's definitely not we should paint every single house in the world white on top, but there are a lot of ways in which this seems to be beneficial for particularly sunny areas where there is a lot of light, a lot of heat problems. I'm actually thinking of Montreal where I am and some of the issues that you get in Montreal. This is really interesting. How you would roll this out, I am not entirely sure, but there are a few possibilities. One way that you would roll this out would be to encourage it as part of a rebate system or as part of a green building initiative. We already have systems like this in Canada, and I'm not sure whether or not this is already covered by them or if this is something that's ever being considered. Again, I'm not going to pretend to be able to give a final answer on this. There seems to be generally some evidence that this works, that this is something that's beneficial to people. If there is anybody listening who is in fact an expert on this topic or has studied it academically, please do write in. I'd be really interested to hear what you have to say, particularly if there's been any policy attempts at this. Could look at some sort of mandate for larger buildings, for instance, for them to have white roofs, particularly apartment blocks, where is it going to really affect anybody at all if, on a 3-story apartment block, the roof is white? I doubt that very much. It's going to be beneficial for the reasons I've just said, but, is that really going to affect the visual appeal of the roof? That's probably a very easy sell, but again, you could face that sort of industry pushback. If you are listening to this podcast and you have a question, or you want to write in to respond on this topic, you can write to us at info@sierraclub.ca. We'll be very happy to hear from you. A reminder also that you can take action on environmental issues by visiting sierraclub.ca. We have tons of petitions, other actions and events, and regular news updates you can sign up for on the homepage. You can also find Sierra Club Canada on social media, and you can listen to the Environment in Canada podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, iHeartRadio, and YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. This podcast also airs on CKUT Broadcast Radio in Montreal, 90.3 FM, bi-weekly on Tuesdays, 11 a.m. ET. Don't forget to click follow or subscribe so you get the latest episodes from us.